Okay, welcome everybody. And as we are wont to do, we have always interesting. This has been an incredible week. I must give kudos to my friend John King for the amazing guests we've had this week. And so, as soon as I get him plugged in here. Good morning, Mr. King, sir.
Good morning, Peter.
How are you?
I'm doing good.
Okay, good. Now, we have special guests in the studio. First of all, Mehrdad, professor of history at the University of Montana, joining us this morning. Also, Owen Sears or Sears?
Owen Sears.
Sears, okay, gotcha.
Sears went bankrupt.
Oh, they're still around. Anyway, he's with the Defense Language Institute, and so we are here to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. And who better than our friend, the Mehrdad Kia?
So we are. Good morning first to Peter and John, and thank you very much for organizing this wonderful show. So we are joined, as Peter just mentioned, with really an outstanding professor and scholar, Owen Sears, who is at the Defense Critical Language and Culture Program.
Oh,
that's the correct title, which is affiliated with the Mansfield Center.
Makes for a really big business.
Brevity clearly isn't critical.
Okay, all right, gotcha.
With the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. And Owen has been here, Owen, for how many years now? Many years.
I've been here for 10 years now.
10 years, yeah. And so it's really a special honor to have him with us. And today, given the fact that there is so little talk about the real issues out there in the world, and so few of these issues have been actually brought up in any in-depth fashion in any of these presidential debates,
they're too busy calling each other names.
So go beyond the mudslinging and actually bringing some of these issues. And we were just talking with Owen, and I told him perhaps we want to start this morning with this very interesting revelations in one of these WikiLeaks, right? That former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton actually wrote that she had concluded that Saudi Arabia and Qatar, these two countries, Saudi Arabia is Saudi Arabia, but Qatar is this country on the southern shores of the Persian Gulf, they were directly involved in funding and supporting ISIS.
Directly as in like the state entity itself, or just people that live in the country?
Well, with 7,000 princes, I'm sure you can find a few who can send. You can find a few who can go under the radar and send sufficient amount of money. But we have had this show and this discussion several times during this show that we have to look at the money. Who is buying all the tanks? Who is buying all the motorized divisions? Who is funding ISIS? And, of course, we have suggested several times here that the money has to be traced back to a very, very good friend of the United States, the Wahhabi Islamic fundamentalist state of Saudi Arabia. And clearly now we are vindicated by WikiLeaks basically confirming that one of the threads, one of the origins goes back to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So the question is, why are the Saudis supporting ISIS? At least I'm relieved to know that ISIS did not appear from above the clouds, that it has some funder and supporter on the ground. And it happens, interestingly enough, like in the case of Pakistan, which I'm sure Owen will talk about, that these are the two great allies of the United States, right, which are also supporting their own terrorist organizations. In the case of Pakistan, of course, Taliban and others. In the case of the Saudis, ISIS.
Wow.
So it would be really interesting to kind of open the discussion. And Owen, if you want to start with some opening comments. Thank you.
No, it just strikes me what you were saying, Mehrdad, about how key U.S. allies in the region are backing U.S. Enemies in the region, and we're talking specifically about terrorist organizations. So, for example, with Pakistan, you raised that country. We have pumped the equivalent of $25 billion in Pakistan since 2001 on the understanding that they would help us with the war in Afghanistan. And, of course...
May I just jump in here?
Yeah.
Where did that money go? What did you say? $20 billion? $25 billion. It's not a big country. Where'd all that money go?
That money went to the Pakistani military.
Okay.
The Pakistani establishment will complain that, the United States is funding our military, not giving money to civilian aid. And, of course, that's the way the Pakistani government has wanted it to be. We buy them tanks. We buy them fighter jets. We buy them attack helicopters. All of this has been going into the Pakistani army.
So no, let me see if I can get this right. We've given all this money to them. They buy tanks, they buy missiles, all sorts of stuff. And once they're a couple of years old, they put them in the used tank lot, and then they either sell them or give them to ISIS. Is that right? Or am I wrong?
Or the Taliban.
Okay. I'm just forgive the analogy, but I'm thinking, my goodness, how do they get away with this stuff?
Well, that's what astounds me is the fact that the U.S. government, regardless of administration and regardless of political party, plays this double entendre, this double game with the Pakistanis. On the one hand, they're our allies. Remember, they were declared a major non-NATO ally. At the same time, we knew damn well that they were backing the Taliban. We knew damn well that they were backing various groups aimed at India, a notorious one called Lashkar-e-Taiba, which was responsible for the attacks on Mumbai. To me, it's mixed policies. We're not calling it what it is. And I think you'd say the same about Saudi Arabia, for that matter.
Okay, go ahead, John.
So, quick question. When we say that these countries are backing these groups, it's my understanding, and this is something that was pretty widely talked about in the media, that the Green Revolution kind of put a little bit of fear in some of the ruling elites in the Middle East, and that groups like
this is the Green Revolution 2009 in Iran.
Exactly. Well, but also, they called it the Arab Spring, where you had quite a few
that came after the Green Revolution.
Exactly.
It started in 2010. Yes.
And it spread to other countries, right? And so you have countries kind of afraid for their entitled positions of leadership and rulership, right? And so I guess my question was, I could easily interpret some of this money going out if I didn't know where the exact lines are. I'm hoping you can explain that to me. As money paid to make that not happen in my hometown, right? Like, here, Taliban, you take this money and go mess in someone else's country. Or here, ISIS, go mess in Syria, but stay out of Saudi Arabia.
Part of it may be that, but part of it is the Saudis, like Israel, like Turkey, they have been infuriated by the fact that we targeted Saddam Hussein. And by removing Saddam, we opened a new front in the region, which is basically allowing Iran to expand its influence.
Because he was a known quantity, is that it?
He was a known quantity, but he was also a quote-unquote Sunni Muslim Orthodox Arab, whereas as a result of the collapse of the Iraqi state, a pro-Iranian Shia state emerged basically in Iraq. Iran's influence expanded. By removing Taliban in Afghanistan a little bit before that, once again, Iranian influence increased in the east in Afghanistan. So the Saudis are furious. And over, the Obama administration has been saying, let's go after ISIS. And the response from Saudi Arabia is, no, let's go after Iran. And why are you signing a nuclear deal with Iran while Iranian influence is expanding? And why are you bribing Tehran to be the naughty boy that it is? Let's go and contain them.
Man, well, we're up against a break. There's so much going on here. We also have a caller. We have Catherine that wants to visit with you guys. We'll get her on right after the break. We have 3 other lines open. 721-1290 is our number. We haven't even talked about the fact that the missiles are flying over there, for crying out loud. So we're going to come right back with more in a moment. And we are back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. We have, of course, Mehrdad Kia, University of Montana history professor. Owen Sears is with us, regional studies professor with the Defense Language Institute. And on the phone right now, we have our friend Catherine. Hi, Catherine. What's on your mind?
Good morning.
Hi.
Okay, hello. Several things are on my mind. Saudi Arabia has given upwards of $30 million plus to the Clinton Foundation, to do what, I don't know. The saber rattling is getting louder. Russia is calling back its non-essential personnel, its children out of foreign schools, which is usually considered a first step on breaking relations with another country, is it not? And Saudi Arabia is also fighting in Yemen, and there's a possibility that we will be drawn into that. I'm not sure,
I
but
think we already have.
yeah, but on a deeper level. And the UK, there's a UK politician who said out loud in front of God and everybody that the UK will shoot down Russian planes. So I was wondering if you could address the kind of the growing Cold War that's kind of on the verge of maybe turning into a hot war with Russia.
Okay, Owen,
What you think
thanks
about
for
that?
the call.
Yeah,
Sure.
No, thanks very much for the question, Catherine. It's a great point that you raise about Russia, because we are seeing a Russia that is unprecedented in its actions. I mean, unprecedented even in the sense of the Cold War, when, Russia was fairly predictable in the sense that we were dealing with a collective leadership. It took them a long time to arrive at a decision. But under Putin, we got one guy running the show. And just to list you a quick series of examples to complement your own. For example, shutting down the Estonian internet, flying simulated nuclear attacks on Stockholm, saber rattling with the Finns, flying long-range bomber patrols into the deep into the Atlantic off the Norwegian, British, French, and Portuguese coasts. I mean, we haven't seen this kind of military activity in decades. It's a really weird flashback to a different time.
Why?
I think a lot of it has to do with Putin himself. This is what astounds me about Russia today, is that we are dealing with one guy, apparently, who's calling the shots. He feels that he needs to reverse the last 25 years of history, essentially the end of the Cold War, which he himself called the single greatest disaster in the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wants to restore that respect and dignity that he thinks Russia lost. And then we can't exclude the fact that the Russian economy isn't doing so well. And we all know what dictators do when the home front doesn't look so good. They trigger international problems to distract their own people.
He also has a major weapon in terms of the oil and gas, pipelines, which provide European countries and countries of European Union with sources of energy. And that's the lifeline of Europe to some degree, but economically very crucial for the Russians. And as Owen correctly mentioned, there is an issue also of the fact that he's going to sort of try this, flex the muscle as much as he can to divert attention from internal issues to more nationalistic issues, which will unify the average Russian citizen behind him. And as long as Europe is worried about the sources of energy and United States does not look at the territory surrounding Russia as a crucial strategic territory, for example, Crimea, he will in fact use military intervention. And that is exactly what he did. I mean, that peninsula, the Crimean Peninsula, is actually part of a sovereign state called Ukraine. And he actually invaded it, and he got away with it. And based on that, he placed jet fighters in Syria. And he's now turning the tide in Syria in favor of Bashar al-Assad's government. So clearly, when he's allowed to, he will use military intervention to flex muscle and to restore Russian prestige and a sense of the Russian Empire, because he has never forgiven Gorbachev for losing the Soviet Empire.
So I wanted to let you listen to a sample of some audio from Jill Stein, who about 1.5% of Americans have heard about. She's a candidate for president this year. She's running on the Green Party ticket. Up there, with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton and Gary Johnson. I think she's fourth out of the four at this point in the race. But I wanted to hear you, because she talks about the threat of electing a particular candidate and a possible nuclear war with Russia. And I wanted you to give me your feedback on her analysis of geopolitics.
Okay, this is about a 2-minute cut, and when we come back, we'll take a break and we'll get our guests' comments. Here we go.
With your question, Steve.
Yes. So, Steve, it's really important to look at where we're going. It's not just a moment in time,
But where has this strategy of voting for the lesser evil taken us? All the reasons you were told to vote for the lesser evil over the last 10 or 12 years, because you didn't want the expanding wars, you didn't want the meltdown of the climate, you didn't want the offshoring of our jobs, or the attack on immigrants, or the massive bailouts for Wall Street. That's actually what we've gotten, by the droves, because we as public interest allowed ourselves to be silent and voted for the lesser evil. But the lesser evil doesn't solve the problem. The Obama administration, even with 2 houses of Congress, actually did all of these things that were, as bad as George Bush in the case of climate, blew the roof off of fossil fuel emissions. Yeah, all of the above gave us some renewable energy, but it completely amplified and intensified fossil fuel production, which has been incredibly destructive to the climate. The wars have gotten bigger. We're now bombing 7 countries. It's really important to look at not just the rhetoric here, but actually look at the track record. And the reality is the lesser evil and the greater evil is a race to the bottom. And even Donald Trump and the right-wing extremism grows out of the policies of the Clintons, in particular NAFTA, which sent our jobs overseas, and Wall Street deregulation, which blew 9 million jobs up into smoke. So that's what's creating this right-wing extremism. A vote for Hillary Clinton isn't going to fix it. And one last point, which is this, that it's now Hillary Clinton who wants to start an air war with Russia over Syria by calling for a no-fly zone. We have 2,000 nuclear missiles on hair-trigger alert, and Mikhail Gorbachev, the former premier of the Soviet Union, is saying we are closer to a nuclear war than we have ever been. Under Hillary Clinton, we could slide into nuclear war very quickly from her declared policy in Syria. So I won't sleep well at night if Donald Trump is elected, but I sure won't sleep well at night if Hillary Clinton is elected. Fortunately, we have another choice other than these 2 candidates who are both promoting lethal policies. But on the issue of war and nuclear weapons and the potential for nuclear war, it's actually Hillary's policies, which are much scarier than Donald Trump, who does not want to go to war with Russia. He wants to seek modes of working together, which is the route that we need to follow.
Okay, there you go. We'll take a break, come right back and get our guests' analysis of those statements. And, of course, your phone calls, too. We have all 4 lines open, 721-1290. Okay, we're back. This is Talkback. Fascinating comments. We haven't even scratched the surface yet. Now, according to what Jill Stein said, so Owen, your reaction to that?
I'd have to say that, of course, Jill Stein has taken her pot shots at just about everybody on that and in those comments. But when she's talking about the threat of Russia, I think we can overhype a threat. And by quoting Mikhail Gorbachev, saying that he's never seen the likelihood of nuclear war higher in his lifetime, that's someone's opinion. What is behind this? What brings this to the fore? Think about the Association of Concerned Nuclear Scientists, who always have that midnight clock.
Right.
And it seems like we've been 5 minutes to midnight since 1955. I think some of this is bogus science. However, that being said, not to underestimate the possibility of a miscalculation, especially in a place like Syria. We have to concentrate on the fact, for example, that Russia has deployed its most advanced surface-to-air missile systems, 2 of them now, in Syria, and these are systems that are advanced, they're sophisticated, and while we focus on the impact that these might have on U.S.-led air operations, we forget on what they might do for Israel operations when it comes to bombing targets in Syria, as the Israelis are wont to do.
And we're out of time for this segment, so we're going to come right back, and we have another whole hour to talk about this. So if you're sitting there on the edge of your seat, sweating and wondering what in the world's going to happen, stay with us. We have another hour.
We'll be back in 5 minutes if the Earth lasts that long.
Yeah, hang in there. I think we'll probably make it through the newscast. So our number is 721-1290, 1-800-568-5309. If you're at work and you're not allowed to call, you can always send in a Facebook question. We will be back in a few minutes. Okay, we are back, and we are continuing our conversation. John King over there. I'm Peter Christian. Joining us in studio, Mehrdad Kia, University of Montana professor of history, and Owen Sears, who is a regional studies professor at UM, working with Defense Language Institute. So go ahead, John. What do you got?
Question from Elena. She wants to know if either of you attended Pastor Shahram Hadian's lecture on Tuesday night.
He was at the Doubletree.
Yes. No, I did not.
No, they both said no.
Okay. So there you go.
Let's jump back into geopolitics a little bit. So we heard the clip from Jill Stein talking about policy from Hillary Clinton possibly destabilizing the Syria and Russia alliance and leading to a nuclear war of some sort. You know, as America looks forward over the next 4 years, I am looking past the next 4 years, no matter what happens, to a brighter future. But you know, what do you think is the most likely scenario of what will happen if either Hillary or Donald Trump are elected? And what would you recommend they do as far as policy towards this region going forward?
Yeah, you have a call from the hotline. Owen, what's your advice for the new president?
Oh, that's a big one, isn't it, Peter? My advice to the new president is to carefully define what U.S. national interests truly are. I would argue that Syria specifically has never been a U.S. national interest, only to the extent that it involves Israel and wars. And so are we really losing Syria? And I think we've never had Syria to begin with, so there's really nothing to lose. Now, Iraq is another story, and of course we always have to point to the existence of oil as a case in point. Another line in the sand, and I'll pass over to Mehrdad here, I think another line in the sand is going to be the preservation of the NATO alliance. Regardless of what one of the presidential candidates said, this still is the cornerstone of our defense policy, and we can't just give up Estonia to Putin on account of a whim. This is our credibility on the line here, and it's not just in Europe, but also in the Middle East.
Real quick, because we haven't talked about Estonia, what's going on there that led to that comment?
Well, what's been happening in Estonia is Vladimir Putin has identified what he perceives as a chink, a weakness in NATO's armor. Estonia is a NATO member, has been a NATO member for over 10 years now. There is a Russian minority in Estonia, which, of course, Putin has not hesitated to exploit their grievances, specifically linguistic grievances, against the Estonian government. Now, what they've been doing is saber-rattling, violating Estonian airspace. I mentioned earlier, taking down the Estonian internet, kidnapping Estonian intelligence officers and dragging them across the border. All of this are probing operations designed to test our resolve, to test NATO's resolve. And how we've responded in part, at least NATO, as far as NATO is concerned, is joint air patrols in the Baltics.
And if you want to alienate NATO and not work on what I agree with Owen in terms of strengthening that alliance, is to actually become involved in Syria. Because that's the last thing NATO wants to get involved in terms of cost, in terms of material, in terms of man and woman power on the ground. And for what reason? To alienate Russia and to antagonize Russia, which is actually the biggest supplier of energy to Europe. Europe is not going to join us. So as a result, this will be a U.S. alone sort of operation. And this is what worries me about, I'm not sure what Donald Trump's foreign policy agenda is, to be very blunt. But this is what worries me about.
He has advocated using NATO to go against ISIS, though.
Yeah, but that's in case of just single military operations,
right.
Not in terms of long-term on-the-ground operation. What worries me about Secretary Clinton's approach is this no-fly zone over Syria and so on and so forth. I would not make Syria a centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. There is China, there is North Korea, there is rise of India, there is rise of Iran. And there is our alliance with NATO and the European market. All this, and we go to Syria.
So is Syria,
to me, it's very worrisome.
Is Syria just a straw man here, or
look, Syria, as Owen also alluded to, Syria has never been an ally of the United States. Has never been a strategic region as far as the United States is concerned, other than the fact that Syria was involved in the 1967 June War and the 1973 October, the Yom Kippur War. And in that sense, it was only because of its alliance with Egypt against Israel that we were worried about Syria. Otherwise, since 1970, when Hafez al-Assad became the president of Syria, an Alawite, Ba'athist, nationalist, socialist, Syria has been always an ally of Soviet Union. And we have taken that for granted. And today, it continues to be. So what is the difference? And why should we get involved in Syria?
So it seems to me that the viewpoint of Hillary Clinton is that the Russia issue, that we kind of are in another Cold War, as you had mentioned earlier, Owen, that Putin is kind of making a call back to the Cold War era. And I think that Hillary sees it in that light and sees Syria as, yeah, they've never been an ally of the United States, but they've been a pretty close ally to Russia. And to weaken Syria would be to weaken Russia. And I guess I've always kind of seen it as a part of a bigger proxy war against Russia.
Yeah, but there was actually a legitimate question to Secretary Clinton, and that is, who will then replace Assad? Let us get involved. Let us actually undermine the Russian policy of supporting Assad. Who are we supporting? The last time I checked, we spent several $100 million, and we had 10 people on the ground who actually defected and sold their weapons to ISIS. And the question is, who is on our side, and who are the good guys here? The list of the people fighting Assad. Not that Assad is anyone that I can support, but the people who oppose him are as bad and sometimes even worse, believe it or not. So we're going to arm what? We're going to go back to the Afghan model of arming the Mujahideen against the Marxist government and get what? In the end, we get Taliban.
That's certainly worked out well before. Okay, we're going to take a break. And poor Owen's going, I'm going to talk. They're going to let me talk eventually. So actually, we have 4 lines.
You will.
We're going to come right back. And by the way, where else can you hear a conversation like this? Not around Grandma's kitchen table, I can tell you that. So we will continue with Talk Back in a moment. This is Talk Back. We're rolling right along here, talking about what's going on in the Middle East right now. Our special guests in studio, Mehrdad Kia and Owen Sears from the University of Montana. And between the two of them, lots and lots of experience in what's going on in the Middle East. So, gentlemen, let's pick up where we left off. So go ahead, Owen.
Well, I think one of the points that we need to understand is the perspective of Russia, okay? I mean, it's all fine and well to shake our finger at Putin, but we need to understand what's motivating him. Remember, as far as the Middle East is concerned, from Putin's perspective, it's been one of loss, consistent loss. First, his buddy Saddam went, and Saddam was a loyal buyer of Russian weapons. He didn't always pay on time, and of course, there's still outstanding debts. Another client of Russia's was Libya. Muammar Gaddafi also bought a lot of Russian weapons, although he too didn't always pay on time. So now they're left with Syria. That's their last stand, right? From Russia's position, it's just been one of steadily eroding prestige and pride in this part of the world. And I think Syria has been the place where Vladimir Putin has decided to draw the red line. And I don't think it would be wise on our part to meddle in something like Syria when, as I mentioned earlier, it's never really been an American national interest.
Allow me to ask this question. What would happen if we just back off and say, okay, you guys do whatever you want to Syria. We don't care. And so what would be the end game there? And Mehrdad, maybe you both can answer this. What would happen to Syria if everybody just backed off and let them do whatever the heck they wanted?
You know, I always tell my students that the best example is Lebanon from 1975 to 1990. These guys ripped each other to pieces. Factional wars, sectarian wars, ethnic wars. And in the end, what happened? They realized that they had to live together, even though they had killed a lot of each other, and they went back to the status quo ante, in other words, to 1975 again with a couple of modifications. If Syria is to exist as a state, and that's a whole other issue, then I think, and as brutal as this sounds, I mean, they need to fight it out. And I don't think we have a role in determining whether or not Syria should survive as a country.
And Syria was never meant to become a country. You know, there's a little bit of history might be helpful. It was actually put together by the French. And it has always been...
World War I, right?
Yeah. It's during First World War, they negotiated the Sykes-Picot and from then on, it's all history, as they say. And Syria has always contained many different confessional groups, but also different ethnic and linguistic groups. Kurds are there, for example. The Alawites themselves are a very unique cultural, religious community. And, this is basically the unraveling of the British-French project, which was to create these mini semi-colonial mandates, as they call them, or really colonies. And today in front of us, it's melting. And you have to allow the sorry to say this, the melting to continue for the Syrians to figure out what kind of country they want to live in. Clearly, the Alawite regime in Syria, which has been in minority, and it is a minority community of 12-15%, depending on who you talk to, cannot hold on to the entire Syrian territory today. Militarily, it depends on Russia and Iran and the other proxies. We haven't even talked about Hezbollah, the Shiite Lebanese organization helping the Assad regime. But my sense is let the Iranians have more casualties. Let the Russians have more jet fighters shot down over Syria. Why should United States become involved in this mess?
Or NATO, for that
Or
matter.
NATO, for that matter.
Yeah. So in the perspective of NATO, for those maybe who've just joined us and don't really know what NATO is, they might even not know what the acronym stands for, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So if you could, maybe, Owen, you probably know better than anyone, who are the NATO nations and what does their charter tell them that they should do when one of their member nations is threatened or attacked?
Oh, thanks for that question, Peter. I mean, when we're talking about NATO, we're talking about a defensive alliance that was originally created in 1949 to offset the Soviet Union and its perceived expansion into Eastern Europe.
Our erstwhile allies in World War II. Right?
Our erstwhile allies in World War II, and a lot of those countries are our allies in NATO now.
Right.
So what we're talking about is an alliance that includes two North American countries, the United States and Canada, a whole mess of European countries, I've since lost count, and Turkey. Turkey's kind of the outlier there. But, I mean, again, when Turkey joined the alliance, Turkey's national interest, as it was defined by the regime, was we're a pro-West state. We're trying to enter the European community. And Russia's been a historical enemy of Turkey. So those are the countries that are lined up. Now, is there a commitment to go into Syria? By no means. I mean, what's the threat from Syria except, and here's where you get the interesting scenario, if the Turks go to NATO and say that we are under threat as a member state, and under certain articles of the treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty, there will be an obligation, certainly after a lot of debate, on the part of NATO members to help Turkey out, and that's where you get some wild cards thrown in here.
But that's why the first person to congratulate President Erdogan of Turkey restoring order, and defeating the most recent military coup was none other than Putin, right? Because Putin understands that as long as Turkey is on his side and somehow the relationship is maintained, and there is a great deal of Russian investment in Turkey, a lot of Russian tourism to Turkey, then Turkey would not call foul and it would not challenge Russia's policy in Syria.
May I ask a silly question? And again, I'm the least educated man in the group, but this just popped into my head. Has there ever been, if you will, a buyer's regret for Turkey saying, why did we make the decision to be part of NATO? This is not working out well for us. Well, would that ever happen, or is that a dumb question?
I don't think that has come up maybe until fairly recently. I mean, we have a different Turkish government now. We have a different president of Turkey. I mean, on the one hand, he's cut from the same old autocratic cloth as his predecessors. On the other hand, he wants to take Turkey in a different direction. He wants to rediscover Turkey's ties to the Middle East, where for decades the Turks just pretended it didn't exist. One of the major things that would counterbalance any attempt to split from NATO would be Greece. Remember, Turkey, Greece are adversaries or have been adversaries in the past, and Greece is a NATO member. So I think from Turkey's perspective, why would we quit this alliance and strengthen one of our enemies in the process of doing so?
Okay.
But in case of the Turkish foreign policy, it is not only just the president, it's also the Turkish armed forces. And getting out of the NATO will cause a major havoc as far as the Turkish military is concerned, especially because for years Turkey was the third recipient of U.S. military aid after Israel and Egypt. So for that very reason, and the fact that we have a base in Incirlik in southeastern Turkey, all of that actually, though Erdogan might want to become a Middle Eastern Islamic power, that will prevent him from going that far.
Okay, go ahead, John. We need to take a break. So.
Well, when we come back from the break, I'd really like to get your interpretation of the current U.S. election in light of Russia. After painting him as a dirty old man, the biggest tactic against Donald Trump has been to highlight connections between Donald Trump and Russia. Whether it's his tax returns, they hint that there might be links to Russia. Whether it's the leaked WikiLeaks, they say are Russian origin, or whether it's talking about Donald Trump's praise of Putin and Putin's praise of Trump, there's obviously a coordinated effort on part of the Hillary Clinton campaign to make Trump look like he's too friendly with Russia.
But
John, thank you very much. This provides me an opportunity to leave the studio and leave the microphone to Owen. I knew something like that was going. No, I'm just joking.
And I guess my one piece of advice would be keep your shirt on. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back. 721-1290 is the number, and all four lines are open if you want to get in on this conversation, and we are rocking it here, talking about what's going on in the Middle East. Owen Sears joining us. He's a regional studies professor. Mehrdad Kia also here with us this morning, and with us, the combined knowledge of what's going on in the Middle East is far more than, well, me, I know that. So where were we before we were so rudely interrupted here?
I had left the last segment asking, it sounds like Owen, because Mehrdad ran with his tail between his legs. But
Not yet.
But I had asked a question of why is all this effort to link Donald Trump to the Russians, and maybe their links are real. But the foreign involvement in the U.S. election campaign is really interesting this year, not only with Russia and Trump, but also all of the different groups that donated through the Clinton Foundation and the later rewards and benefits that they received through the State Department is an interesting topic, especially with the new WikiLeaks documents. I was hoping you might be able to comment on that.
Owen, it's all yours.
Wonderful question. Great. There's no doubt in my mind that we've seen unprecedented foreign influence peddling in U.S. elections. I mean, you might recall 1996 with the Clinton campaign and Chinese links and contributions to his second term. And that sort of sets at least a level that you can measure against. But look, let's face it, in the end, Donald Trump is his own worst enemy. He said a bunch of things that raise legitimate questions about his connections with the Russians. He's offered up Estonia on a platter to Vladimir Putin because apparently he's recognized, I'm not sure how much Donald Trump really understands the situation, recognizes that Putin has some national security interests in the Baltics, but I mean, Estonia is a NATO member. I think part of the problem is that you have the Trump campaign urging Russian state entities to release emails that they may or may not have collected from the Clinton campaign without her knowledge, and are holding them back in this infamous October surprise, right? That at some point WikiLeaks is going to divulge new revelations about connections, and in this case here we're getting to your second part of your question, links between the Clinton Foundation, the Saudi government, because of course Saudi Arabia has always been daddy warbucks, right? The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, you name it. And I think what we're seeing here is, yes, there's definite Russian involvement and influence that should be brought to question, but both sides are slinging at each other. And it's raising a whole bunch of what I think are very legitimate issues about foreign influence peddling in our election campaign. And it's not just Russia, although obviously that's something that should be of concern.
Now, one of the things that Donald Trump has criticized NATO about is that he says a lot of these smaller countries like Estonia, they're not paying their dues, so why should they be considered a member of, you know what I mean? So is that true or not?
Well, actually, it's ironic because Estonia is one of the few NATO countries that's actually paying more than 2%. So it's almost like he singled them out and it was the wrong country. Yes, okay. If you're going to pick on a country in NATO for not pulling its weight, I think the Germans would come to mind. Okay. I mean, I'm just fascinated by stories coming out of the Bundeswehr, the German army, that they had an exercise recently and they didn't have enough assault rifles for all their soldiers. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a really strange Germany.
Yeah.
Not the one we've been used to in the past anyway.
Right.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you about before we run out of time, and by the way, the phone lines are open, 721-1290. You can ask whatever crazy question you have, and we'll make sure Mehrdad doesn't run away. We got the doors barred. My question was about this whole thing with Saudi Arabia. The U.S. House and Senate overrode, I think it was the first veto vote that they've been able to override of President Obama's, and it was to allow the 9/11 victims' families to sue Saudi Arabia for its involvement, if it is there. I guess they're going to go look for the evidence, in the 9/11 terror attacks. And I was hoping you could give us some perspective on why the president would be so stalwart against this, despite a lot of outcry from, just common people. Common man sees a lack of justice in that scenario, right? And wants to see some repercussions for people in power that might have funded those. And after the WikiLeaks come out that they're actively funding ISIS, Saudi Arabia is looking more and more like the bad dog behind the shed.
Okay, we're going to come right back and talk about that when we come back from our break. 721-1290. Again, as John mentioned, all four lines open. If you're sitting there on the edge of your seat, the sweat rolling down your forehead, then you're probably not alone. We are right back, coming right back. Hey, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. All four lines open, talking with Mehrdad Kia and Owen Sears about what's going on in the Middle East. Now, we just had an interesting position there about what's going on with Saudi Arabia, and so go ahead.
So what John is referring to is 28 pages of a very long report, which is the 9/11 report, and it focuses on the role of Saudi Arabia in supporting, or at least having,
or even sponsoring.
Sponsored, but having at least contact with some of those who participated in the terrorist attacks in September of 2001. This is just a personal comment beyond the analysis. The United States of America was attacked, right, by a group of terrorists, the majority of whom were Saudi citizens. The attack was sponsored, at least financially, we know that for a fact, by a Saudi citizen by the name of Osama bin Laden. I think the victims of this terrorist attack has the right, and the United States government has the obligation to provide all the facts relating to this terrorist attack. And if I had been one of the aggrieved victims or a relative of a victim, I would demand that. Why doesn't the United States government allow this or try to sort of push it under the rug, basically? It's because we are, as in the case of Pakistan, I think, we have always bribed our naughty, allies. Pakistan is, do you want $2 billion more this year? How many tanks would you like? How many jet fighters would you like? And the fear is that by alienating the Saudis, the source of cheap oil will dry up, or the Saudis might go to China, or even worse, to Russia. And that we will lose a major ally and a source of energy, which gives us a great deal of prestige and power vis-a-vis our European allies, vis-a-vis East Asian powerhouses like Japan, Korea, and China. But at one point, I think we have to set our foot down and say, the truth is the truth, and we need to know the truth, and we need to know the role of Saudi Arabia. Whatever it may have been, this has to come out sooner rather than later.
Now, Owen, what are the other implications if this? It was hugely overridden. The veto was overridden by it, almost an unprecedented margin. So if this goes forward, what happens next?
Well, I think, as far as the Congress was concerned, it was the public opinion, right? I mean, you cannot vote against or override a bill that would prevent an American citizen from asking for the truth, as Dr. Kia mentioned. I find it astounding that this 28-page report took, 15 years to get declassified, and then when you actually read it, you're thinking, what's the big deal? So then that leads to the next suspicion. There's got to be more. And in my experience working in the U.S. government, Saudi Arabia was always handled as a special case, even on the intelligence side. certain information pertaining to Saudi Arabia was always a separate channel, and only those who were read in were allowed access to it, which, of course, raises questions of another sort. But getting to your question more specifically, I think what concerned the administration was the diplomatic impact, the judicial impact, the potential for other countries to use this American precedent to go after U.S. citizens allegedly involved in war crimes. We could go through a whole list of U.S. generals and admirals, not to mention soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen, who individually may or may not have been involved in the deaths of Afghan or Iraqi citizens, or former CIA case officers and station chiefs who may have been involved or may not have been involved in the apprehension of alleged terrorists in Italy, for example. So I think from the administration's perspective, they didn't want to open up Pandora's box internationally by giving other countries an opening to doing the same to us, as this bill proposes to do with the Saudis.
Well, don't you think that one of the principal causes, and those are all, I completely agree with Owen, but the first thing I think the administration is worried about is the number of lawsuits which will be filed against Saudi Arabia, and the embarrassment and the financial burden of then having to deal with each case. And we are talking about enormous amount of money, but enormous amount of embarrassment in the world public opinion. And it's going to damage the Saudi prestige and power. And this is what is very bothersome to the Saudi regime. But look, the overwhelming majority of those who attacked this country were Saudi citizens. It was basically, once again, it was funded and organized by Osama bin Laden. And it's high time that we accept the fact that our ally was basically the base from which the organization Al-Qaeda was basically organized. Yes.
All right. It seems to me, and it sounds from your conversation, that Russia is a belligerent sinking ship, that it is heading its own destruction. And by the way, as soon as Putin goes away, if he is such the strong man and the one point of control, I mean, it's even going to become more decentralized as when he passes away. In this milieu, there's another story going on in China. Is there an opportunity for the U.S. to pull China in a more humanitarian direction and to partner with China to strengthen influence of democracy and freedom in the region?
Okay, we'll talk about that when we come back. Take a quick break. Wow, we're really getting in deep here. 721-1290 is our number, and I hope you're learning a lot, because I sure am. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number. 1-800-568-5309. Three lines open. And joining us, Owen Sears and Mehrdad Kia. John just asked a very interesting, provocative question, if you will, Owen, about teaming up with China in all of this to perhaps get some things going with them that perhaps we haven't had a chance to do yet.
I think that's a great question, Peter, and it raises a whole bunch of questions in the future about shifting great power alliances. So I don't think China would have the remote interest of teaming up with the United States on a human rights agenda, let alone, how do we deal with Russia in pick a region of the world. I see the possibility, given China's trajectory right now as an economic power, as a military power, and it just seems to be going upward. You don't see the same with Russia, on the other hand. I see the distinct possibility, whether we like it or not, and whether we're willing to imagine it or not, that at some point, 50 years from now, Russia and the U.S. might have some common understandings about China, because the Russians have their own issues with China that date back well into the last century. And that's something that as a foreign policy guy, I'm sitting back and I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, just wait and see. I mean, right now, of course, Russia looks very belligerent. China is certainly not friendly, given what's happening in South China Sea. But let's see what's going to happen in the future, because I don't think Russia and China are natural allies.
Okay. Now, it would be interesting at this point to have somebody like Bob Seidenschwartz here from the Montana World Affairs Council, who is a financial guy. Because whenever we talk about these issues, mixed in with all of this is economics, and what benefits one economically also has to do with one diplomatically, strategically, militarily. It's all part of the salad or the stew, if you want to call it, the soup. So, can either of you address that, or is that beyond your bailiwick? What do you think, Owen?
I'm going to let Bob speak to those questions. I'm not a financial expert.
Sure.
Other than we all understand the fact that China still controls or still owns a part of the official U.S. debt. We are still in trade deficit with China, and I guess what astounds me from a historical perspective is that the focus we have no focus on our trade deficit with China like we did with Japan. Remember back in the 1980s, Japan is number one. They're buying out Times Square, and there was this real fear, but we don't even seem to have that anymore. We almost take it for granted.
Yellowstone Park,
There's another
They conquered
issue.
the world and back to the
The issue also, building on what Owen just said, I think what we do not look at right now, given the fact that Russia is the belligerent power, is that at the same time, Russia is a sort of retreating power, demographically, economically, whereas China is the aggressive, expanding power. Even in terms of demography, the number of Chinese now working in Siberia, northeastern Russia, actually the area of Russia that is more in Northeast Asia is actually being populated as we speak by Chinese migrant workers. So in some ways, the balance of power is tipping very much in favor of China. China is also very intelligently is carving its own sphere of influence in the region which it believes to be of important security challenge to Chinese hegemony. And that is South China Sea, Korean Peninsula. Of course, China's dream is always to keep the Korean Peninsula divided, and North Korea serves that interest, of course, very well, and beyond. So, I mean, at the same time, the Chinese are maintaining very good relationship with the distant Middle East, right? They actually have negotiated with the Assad regime already for the day when Syria needs to be reconstructed. There is need for roads to be reconstructed, airports to be reconstructed, hotels and motels be reconstructed, and why not make a bucking in Syria as well? But they will not get involved militarily anywhere in the Middle East region.
Okay, we have a caller. Let's get to the phone. And Larry, you are on with Mehrdad and Owen. Hi.
Yeah.
Good morning. Fascinating discussion, and I've been kind of in and out, so maybe you have answered this. With all the focus on Syria, we haven't heard much about what's going on in Egypt and Libya. And I wondered, as a follow-up, what do you consider the most imminent threat in the Middle East? What country? And I'll hang up and let you answer that.
Larry, hold on. A threat to whom?
Yeah.
A threat to whom?
A threat to further destabilization and probably a threat to the U.S.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the call, Larry.
Okay.
So, gentlemen?
Okay, well, thank you for that question, Larry. The response to your Egypt-Libya question is a good one, if only because Libya has sort of been forgotten in the mix here. I mean, we tend to forget, one, that Libya is an oil power, two, that Libya is just overloaded with weapons, thanks to Muammar Gaddafi, and now they're in the hands of 1,000 militias, and that Libya has two governments for all intents and purposes, and Egypt is hanging on the borders there, maybe or maybe not thinking about, why don't we carve our own sphere of influence in eastern Libya, where most of the oil is. It would be very convenient, and historically speaking, Egypt has had a big influence in Cyrenaica, which is that part of Libya. Getting to your question about what I think is the most destabilizing state in the region, and I think Mehrdad will agree with me on this, I think it's Iran. Iran has its own definite interests. It sees the post-Saddam era as a wonderful, God-given gift to extend its influence throughout the region. Iraq is now, as far as Iran's concerned, Iraq is now safe in Iran's corner, more or less. It looks like the tide's turning in Syria. And, of course, the losers in all this would be the Saudis, at least from the Saudi perspective.
And in the context of this excellent question by Larry, something very interesting is happening in the Arab world, and I want to ask Owen to also comment after the break, hopefully.
Thank you.
And that is the question of Egypt was always the leading Arab state. I mean, remember Nasser in 50s and 60s, of course, and even with Sadat until he became a pariah because of signing the Camp David Accords. Now Egypt is moving more and more into the orbit of Saudi Arabia because financially and economically, the Saudis are emerging as the principal Arab power. And Egypt has lost its central role in Arab politics. And of course, though General Sisi enjoyed some popularity after he overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood government, now that popularity is fading very rapidly because the military regime in Egypt has failed to really produce anything exciting and anything new economically. So for all that reason, Egypt has become more or less a retreating state, a retreating power, having lost much of its regional power to Saudi Arabia. By the way, the two countries are now building a bridge, right, over the Red Sea, and that is also funded by the Saudis under the guise of facilitating the trip by Egyptian pilgrims during the holy pilgrimage of Hajj.
Right.
Exactly.
We're going to come right back. Whew, my goodness. And on we go. You can't tell one from the other without a program. Get your program right here. We'll be right back.
It was a big
Back on Talkback, 721-1290 is the number, 1-800-568-5309. And the one thing we haven't even asked about yet is Israel. So, Owen, I realize that right smack dab in the middle of all this, are they just an interested spectator, or what's going on in Israel?
Depends on what country you're focusing on. With respect to Iran, of course, this has been an ongoing Israeli concern, and certainly Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, has sacrificed a lot of support, at least in the administration, for appealing directly to the U.S. Congress a few years ago about the Iranian nuke deal. But when it comes to Syria, I like the analogy of the Israelis sitting at the top of Mount Hermon, which is the highest mountain in the Levant, which Israel controls. It's in the occupied Golan Heights, which used to belong to Syria, and they're enjoying the show. Because, look, let's face it, in the end, their worst adversaries are fighting and killing each other. Hezbollah from Lebanon, they're now distracted fighting to keep the Assad regime in power. Assad, another well-known enemy. All those Islamist militants, they're all fighting and killing each other. And the Israelis are sitting back and, like I said, enjoying the show, because I think in the end, they don't have a dog in this fight up until now. Who knows what's going to happen? I think the deployment of Russian forces to Syria from an Israeli perspective has been very concerning. Because it limits Israel's ability to operate in Syria. I mean, they've been used to basically flying anywhere they want in Syria. They blew up a nuclear facility a few years ago, and now that's questionable.
And the shifting sands of Middle Eastern alliances is amazing in some ways, because given the fact that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel feel very much antagonized by the Obama administration's rapprochement with Iran, you find actually the Saudis and the Israelis coming together in opposing the foreign policy of the Obama administration. And so while the Saudis were complaining about the negotiations between the United States and Iran, the Israelis then were coming to Washington and appealing to the Congress to somehow stand up to President Obama's decision to negotiate with the Iranians.
So obviously Israel is afraid of Iranian power. Saudi Arabia is afraid of Iranian power. I've always thought of the Iranians as kind of the underdog in the Middle East as far as the Shia alliance versus the Sunni alliance. And I just wanted to get your take on that. Going forward, do you think the Shia alliance or the Sunni alliance is more of a threat to U.S. influence?
And of course, this Shia-Sunni alliance, which is put in a kind of a more religious terms, it can also sort of mask the ancient Persian Arab hostility, which goes back to 7th century in terms of which power which ethnic and linguistic group will dominate. But I leave the rest of the answer to Owen.
We have 2 minutes. Go.
Okay. Well, I'm going to say in 2 minutes, essentially, right now it's easy to say that the so-called Shia alliance, the Iran and its allies are on the march in many parts of the Middle East. And Iran has a very sophisticated capability to distract and tie the Saudis down. If it's not in Syria and Iraq, it's in Yemen, which we haven't even talked about. And I think Saudi Arabia consistently falls for the bait. Iran will say something derogatory towards the Saudi king. The Saudis will get all spun up about it. And I think the Iranians are playing a more sophisticated game than the Saudis.
And there is something, if I may say, and from a person who has been extremely critical of the Iranian regime and its foreign policy, there is something real about Iran, if I may use that word. 75, 80 million population, 57% of university graduates, women, highly sophisticated population with a very strong middle class. And it can run its own economy. It can run its own armed forces and intelligence network and so on. And the Saudis, being so feeble when it comes to some of these issues, constantly depend on foreign powers, in this case, especially us, the United States, to actually take them out of troubled zones and remind them that getting involved in Yemen might not be the best sort of alternative at this time.
In 30 seconds, Owen, where should we be looking in the Middle East to see what's going to happen next, in your opinion?
I think we should be keeping our eyes focused on Turkey right now. Because I think Erdogan is playing a very interesting game. And we've taken Turkey for granted for so long as a good, loyal NATO ally. And Erdogan wants to take Turkey in a different direction. I mean, talking to Vladimir Putin is just one example of that. I don't think there's going to be a Turkish-Russian alliance anytime soon, but I think we're going to see a more independent-minded Turkey with consequences for our policy in the region.
Gentlemen, thank you for sharing so much. We appreciate it. I understand that Congressman Ryan Zinke is going to be on Montana Morning tomorrow at 7:30. You can join us then. Have a great day, everybody.